Hello, everyone, and very welcome to today's Irish Landscape Institute webinar. Today's webinar is on the subject of the practice of using native origin seeds across Ireland for landscaping and habitat restoration projects. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, who's Mark Bryson. Mark is a horticulturalist, a founder, member, and senior consultant of EcoSeeds Limited, which was set up in 1996 as a wildflower seed producing company. EcoSeeds is focused on seed production and habitat restoration. The company pioneered brush harvesting in Ireland and have developed specialised seeding and harvesting equipment. They've delivered a broad range of large-scale habitat restoration schemes compatible with biodiversity net gain, carbon code, and nature restoration law, working with a wide variety of organisations and individuals, including government departments and agencies, local councils, landowners, commercial developers, and environmental NGOs. So I'll ask you all to mute yourselves, and if you have any questions, if you could put them into the chat and I'll ask them to Mark at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Mark for today's presentation.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everybody. And thanks to the Irish Landscape Institute for inviting me here to talk. So as I say, I'm going to talk today a bit about the seed-based restoration and why there's a need for it. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. There's, with climate emergency and biodiversity loss. I'm going to give a sort of global perspective as to where we fit in, and EcoSeeds approach with a more local view to it. I'm going to talk about the three sort of state approaches we would use to restoration. Basically, conservation is always the best, and then what if it can't be used, then what the alternatives are. You're sort of looking at brush harvesting and then next local seed. And then I'll take these in more detail and talk really about creating the conditions for other species to move in, which is quite important, and some of the solutions we've come up with over the years. I haven't done this in a while, so I'm a wee bit rusty, so you'll have to bear with me on it, but I'll do my best. So anyway, as Mark said, we were set up in 1996. We're a not-for-profit organisation, and we started off really as a seed company, producing seeds, and then over time, we've developed into other things. Basically, the first point of these talks I always make is about how our flora are sort of the base of the pyramid that all the other species depend on. So it's important that we look after this, because we're sort of seeing, with climate emergency and biodiversity loss, the most recent BSBI, which stands for the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, said we've now 53% of our native plants, such as heather and harebell, are in decline due to human impacts. Non-native plants now outnumber native plants in the wild. So that's quite shocking. This has led to a huge impact on our insect and other species that depend on these plants. So we've lost 50% of our insects in the last 50 years, another shocking statistic, and 98% of our hay meadows in Ireland in the last 50 years. But when we started, it was still the same figure, and that was nearly 30 years ago, and we're not seeing on any kind of scale even conservation of these habitats, never mind the restoration. Yet within certainly my father's lifetime, he would have talked about clouds of butterflies in the 1930s. So on a global perspective, there's a number of organizations that are involved in restoration ecology. There's in Europe, there's the SER, which is over 5,000 members, and within SER, there's INSER, which is the International Network for Seed-Based Restoration. which looks at how we can use seed to try and mitigate some of this biodiversity loss. And also there's more specifically, there's the European Native Seed Producers Association, which we are members of, and its emphasis is on promoting native seed, and it has a code of conduct, and just basically that's maintaining local genetic diversity, looking at traceability and transparency in seed and seed quality, and sustainable seed sourcing, which I will be talking about more in greater detail. So what I want to talk about firstly is the three approaches really to restoration. And as I said at the beginning there, conservation is always the number one, always best to conserve, because we've lost so much. We need to conserve what we've already got. So if you like, there's a bit of a continuum on that, on the next. If for example, if there isn't the site doesn't have conservation, then we would look next at natural colonization and management. That would be where you've got a good soil seed bank, which I'll talk about more later, and but just by changing the management of the area, looking at changing the cutting regime, that would be the second, that would be the next approach. And possibly with that adding a plant called yellow rattle, which I'll also talk a bit more, to help reduce the site become more diverse. And then after that, our next approach, if that can't be worked, if there's no soil seed bank, for example, we would then use seed brought in, and the most sustainable way to do that would be through brush harvesting, where you're taking seed directly from a habitat and moving it to another similar. And then the third approach would be using seed, if there isn't a local donor site, would be looking at local seed. So really there's a continuum there. And again, a lot of that's to do with people's expectations. On one side you have the sort of pictorial meadows type idea and the heme parks for formal areas, and on the other you have the more natural areas. So there's a sort of continuum, and a lot of, as I say, with our approach, managing what's there already is always the best, if there is some good habitat available. So this photo here would be an area that, with changes to management, if you've got a good seed bank, you can get move towards this. One of the challenges, however, is with this approach is what's in the soil. So for natural colonization, one of the challenges can be, for example, this one here, dock seeds, which can live up to 150 years, and there's something like 225,000 seeds per plant, and so they would be all fairly viable seeds. Even though the seed's not mature, they'll still be viable. So they have quite a large, they've quite a high germination rate compared with something like bird's foot trefoil, which is a little small legume which doesn't produce a lot of seed. But in some ways, that little butterfly that I showed you the picture of earlier on, that's its food plant. So it's quite important. It's quite important to have these species. But as I say, that's if possible, natural colonization is always the best way to go. So one of the ways that this can be, that we've used before, is to add this species here, which a lot of people are familiar with, is yellow rattle. But it's important to get this species locally, because it is very adaptive to local conditions. So again, if we would always try to say to source this yellow rattle seed locally, which will help. Again, we're trying to create the conditions for species to move in. So what it does is it feeds off the roots of the grasses and makes the sward more open to other species such as orchids, etc., moving into the area. So that's how we would use that with natural colonization and management. But the other thing we find is its public acceptance to this approach. Again, one of the things that's there, it's gaining acceptance where they're going from, say, something like 3-season bedding plants to going straight from that to a more natural meadow, for example. Public acceptance can sometimes be a bit of a challenge, where you're going directly from formal to the wild. So, but again, if our emphasis is on biodiversity, most of the showy plants aren't necessarily the best for biodiversity. So, for example, plants like tufted vetch, which is a wee legume, you would hardly notice it. It would be one that would be very good for insects and especially bees. Oh, sorry, just go. Okay, so where you would use seed if there's no, for example, this site here where you've got a brownfield site, we would and there's not a chance of getting natural colonization, or if, for example, if the stockpiled soils from an agricultural site, for example, and it's been sitting there stored for maybe 5 or 6 years, and the seed rains mostly dock on it, then and once it's spread out, it's not gonna create much that's going to be of benefit to insects. It'll tend to be a monoculture. So the approach here would be, we would be looking at, firstly testing the soil, which in my experience, there's a lot of sites we've looked at where there's been very little soil testings, to see what exactly is in the soil. And one of the tests we would use, as well as your standard pH NPK test, would be to take a small sample using that W pattern and germinating it in a germination cabinet, and that will give you an idea of what's, especially if you don't know the history of stockpiled soil, that would be how you would test it for any vigorous species or any, and also you can work for if there's any invasives on the site. But this would be an example. So what we did on that particular site was we harvested seed from a local nature reserve and used that seed to sow that out. That's at Castle Espy. So there's other sites, for example, ex-agricultural sites that would be tricky, that you're not going to get natural colonization on these sites, because viable seed banks are an interesting thing. Like, I could probably just do this whole talk on soil seed banks, but for natural regeneration, people think that every bit of soil will have quite a lot of variety of seed in it, but that's not the case. And also because, for example, the people will talk about long-term storage of seed. They'll talk about the oldest seed, which was 2,000 years old, which was found and was able to germinate. It was a date palm, which are exceptions. Most of the seed, like we mentioned, dock there, it would be an exception. For example, yellow rattle will only be viable after its viability goes down after about a year. So it's not going to be in, for example, this ex-arable site. So, for example, if you think about the process of getting cereal production, that's going to involve spraying. It's going to involve burying seed, lifting it to the surface, et cetera, and that tends to separate out certain weed species that are able to work, are able to grow after that. So there's an experiment in England where they buried bottles with soil over 150 years and dug it up every 10 years to look at viability of seed, and dock is still there, believe it or not, after all this time. So the longevity of seed is the first one. Certain seeds just don't last very long. The second one, as I say, we talked about viability. The third one would be seed rain, which is where the seed's allowed to fall every year in the same place. And that would be in, for example, stockpiled soil. Also the size of the seed. So if you have a very, very small seed, it's going to go down further in the soil. So you've got the depth that the seed's buried. You've also got predation, which is where the seed's eaten over time. And then you've also got things like soil fertility, which is another variable, soil structure and moisture. If you've got very wet areas, certain seeds aren't able to survive that. Then you've got the thickness of the seed coat, which may affect the dormancy of the seed and also the vigor of the seed as well. So giving a very brief introduction into soil seed banks. So not every millimeter of soil is going to contain a huge range of seed. In some cases it may, where you've got a buildup, but a lot of areas won't have this. For example, where there's been a fire, because a fire if any seed that reaches a temperature of over 36 degrees is killed. So a lot of if you get a very bad burn, you're going to have no a species like heather, for example, up in mountainous areas. So it's not going to come back. If it's a quick burn, it's not going to reach that temperature. But if it does reach that temperature, you lose that seed, and then the soil's not held together as the roots go, and then all that soil's washed away. So it's not going to be it's only going to be blow seed that would be traveling the wind that'll take over. So to get seed back, you need to intervene in some way. Another example would be woodland. Woodland species are very, very slow to move in. So the example would be wood anemone, which only moves 2 centimeters a year. So it's going to take a long time to cover an area. And there has to be an adjacent woodland for that to work. Other examples would be SUDs, sustainable urban drainage systems, or ponds, where you're not going to get that. The same would be where you're clearing invasives and you're spraying those off. You're probably killing a lot of the seed bank as well. So that would be another example where seed would be used. So how we would get that seed, this is an example of brush harvesting, where we're harvesting from an existing meadow to get the seed. Sorry. So this is just what the seed looks like. So other sources of seed, this is our where we would grow the seed as row crops. This process can take in between 3 to 6 years to do this. And the way it's done, we follow what's called the ENSCO-net, which is a European Native Seed Conservation Network, and Kew Gardens would use these protocols as well, where you collect enough with the landowner's permission locally and grow 250 individual plants, and then take seed from that. And then it's grown on larger areas like this and then harvested. So this would be the third alternative. If you can't get used brush harvesting seed, or there's no local source, then we would go for this approach. So as I say, this can take from 3 to 6 years to go from seed collected from the wild to getting this seed, but it's important. It's important that the genetics, as I say, are followed and sustainable. So you only take a small amount from the wild for this, and it's traceable. As I say, to be a member of the European Native Seed Producers Association I mentioned earlier, we have guidelines we have to follow to be members of the organisation. As I say, traceability. So, for example, there's a lot of talk about individual native species and blackgrass coming in. Well, if the seed's harvested locally, that's where the seeds coming in from non-local sources from abroad, whether that's grey imports or but basically coming in. Whereas if it's locally collected seed, you're not going to have that challenge. As I say, all those mixes, we don't collect anything that's rare. For example, it would be the common species, because we're trying to create the conditions for species to move in. So this would be a crop of devil's spit scabious, which is quite a nice species. And other ways of collecting, we would use vacuum harvesting, but that would be mostly for rare species. We would also collect brash, which contains heather seed, or so you're basically taking the seed as well as vegetation, and then that's spread out. So with the being a member of the European Native Seed Producers Association, this is an example of Germany, where they have different regions of Germany where if there's projects that will take place in one part of Germany, they would use seed that comes from that part of Germany. So we're trying to do the same thing in Ireland, where we're looking at trying to get various seed zones so that we can supply local seed for that particular area. So the seeds and the wild and the insects have co-evolved over time. That's the principle of this. So their flowering times coincide with the insects populations, so that rather than if you're bringing in seed from, say, Europe, it's not going to be timed to flower at the same time as the insects, our local insects in Ireland would be ready. So that's why that's very, very important. So this is what we're looking to do. As I say, we're looking to set up a network of donor sites across Ireland, because a lot of species aren't available commercially, that would be in a brush harvesting mix. So there's basically just a brush that spins around and collects what's there. It doesn't cut anything, it just brushes. So that way it's less damaging to insects. And we've collected the odd mice and frog using this technique by accident, but they come out of it a bit shaken. But as I say, it is more gentle than cutting and lifting. As I say, we have this machine as well in the front, so we can harvest quite a larger areas in a quicker time, because we've got a very short window. And especially last year with the way the weather was, we had a very short window for the harvest. So we want to be able to try and cover as much ground as possible. So we'll actually start drying the seed as we're harvesting it, especially in wet conditions. Now you can see on the left-hand side, this area has been harvested, so it can still be cut for hay. and the right seed hasn't, the right side of that hasn't been harvested. Now, with these meadows, some of them can be maybe 100, 200 years old. So we're getting a lot of species. As I said, that the grass species, for example, would be the same species as say would be available as from an agricultural merchant, but they would be less aggressive. And as what we find is the more aggressive the grasses are, they'll tend to crowd out the other species that you want. Although grasses are very, very important for butterfly species and insect species, that will lay, many of them will lay their eggs on them. So they're quite important to have a good range of grasses. And as I say, you'll get that when you harvest directly from old hay meadows. You're getting a good range of grasses. So, for example, the sweet vernal grass we would be harvesting would look similar to the sweet vernal grass that you're getting commercially, but it's been bred and grown in New Zealand or the rest of Europe, and it's been bred for certain characteristics, mainly for cattle, and the same with crested dog's tail, which has been bred for the sports turf industry. So what we are trying to do is to get populations that will be less aggressive of these fine-leaved grasses. As I say, these would be harvested directly from existing meadows, and say we've lost something like 98% of hay meadows in Ireland. So we're looking at trying to get the farmer will get the benefit from a hay crop, as well as getting a seed crop from this. And as I say, once we're in the process of developing a donor site database. We have a form which has got out to the landowners, and they describe what the habitat their type is. So if it's wet or dry or coastal or clay, then we'd have a range of sites. So we're trying to get a good range of sites, so that when and if there's the need for seed for sites, for example, that arable farm I was mentioning earlier, that we would have a good range of donor sites that would match that. The same with wet sites for suds or ponds, but also fires, for example, in Texas. They've have a big problem with fire, so they would regularly collect seed and then store the seed, so they could use if and when they have sites available. So some of the when we've harvested from a site, we would log that area on GPS, so that we know what areas we've harvested from. So when we come back, we have a record of that, and that record goes in the database. So the maximum we would ever harvest would be 80%, and that can only be done for 3 years. But as I say, we're not taking everything, because again, one of the NSPA protocols is that we have to be a member of NSPA. We have to follow certain protocols. One of which would be to take no more than sustainable in terms of harvesting, so that the seeds going back each year. Now the seeds then sown at about 1 to 4 grams per square meter. As I say, we can move. We can cover quite a large area, because all the equipment will fit on the back of a lorry, and then we can go from site to site. So as I mentioned, the drying process is crucial to this, which is the first stage of it, because as soon as you harvest the seed's beginning to die, if you like to think of it that way, but very, very slowly. So what we're trying to do is slow down the process. And there's certain ways to do that. One of the first one is the moisture content, getting the moisture content down. So to say, we've a mobile dryer which we would start. Now this is different to a grain dryer, which is used for drying cereal. You want to dry the grass and native seed down very, very slowly. And then the next thing that affects it will be how it's cleaned and processed. So there's various machines that would use air or would use screens, of which, and the screens separate the length and the width of the seed. Then you've got other seeds that use the specific gravity of the seed, and there's many because of the different sizes and shapes of seed. There's a lot of different machines needed for the cleaning process. Now, with projects, we would get the moisture down. If you're only storing it for 1 year, it needs to be about 65% relative humidity. If it's 2 to 3 years, you're looking at 45% relative humidity. But if you're looking for more long-term storage, you're looking at getting that seed down to 25% relative humidity, which would be more important where you're banking seed, for example. But some projects, such as wind farms, where we would go in before the farm's built and harvest seeds, and then it would be could be 2 to 3 years before the farm's built and they're ready to finishing the cabling for us to put the seed back. So it could be stored for up to 2 years. So then on the receptor side of things, so this is where once you've harvested the seed, got it processed, there's a bit of preparation. For example, if you're looking at where there's been quite a large thatch, you need to take that off. Also, you need to open the soil for the seed. So this is what we would use to do that. And then there's the seed machinery itself to sow the seed. As you can see this from this slide here, the variation in size and shape of the seed. So the way with Australia, with all the fires they've had in Australia, what they are looking at is pelletizing the seed, which is where you put a coating on the seed so it'll go through a standard agricultural drill like that. Whereas our approach was, rather than doing that, we would look at redesigning the machine that actually sows it, so into the receptor site. So what we did was we talked to a local agricultural engineer, because most agricultural and horticultural machines are only designed to sow one type of seed or 2 types of seed. But whereas with the variation, we wanted to be able to sow 2 types of seeds at the same time. So this machine was built for us, and the little small hopper you can see at the front, the silver one, it goes down to very, very fine, a very, very fine setting on it, where it'll go down so at 0.25 grams per square meter. And the other bigger hopper on the left, we would put the larger seeds. So we would split the seed up into larger and smaller seeds, and then sow them, the larger seeds deeper, and the smaller seeds near or on the surface, but they still have to get good contact between soil and seed. So this is designed to be fairly mobile, so we can take it to various sites, and it's designed to sow directly into grass. So it's taken some of the things from agricultural seed drills. So for example, on the front of it has a harrow, so you can open up the grass and sow directly in, and then it has a roller on the back of it, so it can be used to sow as a one-pass system. So you're getting there's less carbon release if you have to ply and rotivate and do all that kind of thing. So again, with the timing of seed sowing, it's important that the right time of year for sowing. We would normally start off. This year's been an exception, but April's May time to sow, and then we would finish off sort of in September, October. Now with yellow rattle, that has to be in before December because it has dormancy. So again, as long as you sow it in before December. So then the next stage of that would be the management and remedial action, because what we find is a lot of sites, if they're not managed properly, are will tend to not, especially if they're in urban sites, will not be the general public will not be happy with them. Usually there'd be complaints and whatever, you know. So we find that, you know, if the management in the first couple of years is crucial, you know, especially year one. So for example, if there is a dock problem, we would tend to say, you know, there's different tools that are designed to mostly from the organic growers, so that we would try and get those out in the first year. So there's an old one that says it would take 7 people 7 hours to weed in on 1 acre in the first year, and the same acre, 7 people, it would take them seven days to weed the same area, because you've got such a difference in growth, especially if we're trying to create perennial grassland. The other thing would be where again you're getting domination of grasses, we would tend to add yellow rattle to try and reduce that. And as I say, we would, based on our soil samples, if it's quite a fertile soil, it may need more. Whereas if you're on a lower fertile soil, you would put it on at a much lower rate. Otherwise, you'll tend to get a monoculture of yellow rattle. As I say, people seem to think it's a cure for just about everything, but it's we would say a site by site approach is very important with that. Yeah, and then the last one's the cut and lift. It's the timing of that. It's very important. Really, when you're cutting and lifting, especially in the first year, we would tend to go a bit later, or a bit earlier in the year. So that allows light to the newly emerging seedlings that are beginning to grow by cutting and lifting. It's also taking nutrient away each time that's done. So it's that early cut in year one is quite important. But as I say, we would normally follow a site specific approach for this. So we would try and put it in with at the early stages of a project, so that in a method statement, for example, when and what height to cut, when this takes place in the prescriptions, because it's quite important. And another one would be litter picking, because longer grass, especially if an area is coming out of amenity grassland to longer grassland, you'll tend to find it gets more litter. So we would get extra litter picking, because there's that old adage that litter tends to attract more litter. So that's another one that's quite important in the specification. Because we find over the years, you know, the tender system's designed to put something out to tender, goes to the cheapest tender. They then are usually bringing seed in from Europe somewhere, so it tends not to do as well. So again, we would tend to promote the using local seed where possible. And again, you're creating the conditions for other people, other species to move in. So that's really everything. Hope I haven't forgotten anything, but so the main takeaway I would say would be that we're looking at, you know, where possible to conserve habitats because they're so few and far between. And then the next approach would be to look at natural colonization if possible, and maybe changing the management. So that would be the approach of mowing less and taking away what you're mowing. But if this isn't possible, the next approach would be brush harvested seed. Again, getting that from a local source as possible. And if that's not available, getting that from a local seed source. And I'd just like to conclude that that biodiversity loss is really, a lot of it is caused by humans, but I think we also have the capacity to create as well as destroy. And I think, you know, some of the processes I've outlined today can be part of that.
That's all right. Thanks very much, Mark. If you want to take a drink of water and a little breather, I'll promote some of our activities before I throw a couple of questions at you. So we have the Irish Landscape Institute Awards are open for submissions next month, running till September will be the closing date for submissions. So everyone start thinking about your projects and preparing your submissions. Keep an eye on the website for further upcoming events as well. They are advertised as we firm up the dates. So Mark, I want to ask you about yellow rattles. Maybe I wonder, is it appropriate for every site, and would you consider the use of other hemiparasites such as red bartia or euphrasia?
Yeah, as I say, we would look at what's the in the soil first off, and what's growing in the surrounding area where you're using it. So as I say, a lot of those species that you mentioned there aren't commercially available, but can be taken by, you can use brush harvesting for those species. But as I say, what's quite important is the seeding rate of those, and when you put that seed on, and where the seed's sourced. And as I said, because although a lot of those certainly yellow rattle seed doesn't store. It's a little flat seed. It's like a parsnip seed, and it just does not store well. So you want fresh seed. But again, it'll depend on the fertility of the site and the amount of grass growth you've got. If you have a very thin soil, open site, you'll tend to sow it at a very low rate. You go down to 0.25 grams per square meter to sow that.
And I noticed in your presentation where you were showing the preparation of an area that had a significant amount of thatch on it. Would you shy away from using herbicides in preparation? I mean, is it possible to do without herbicides altogether in preparing sites, or what do you recommend?
We would take a site-by-site approach. So, for example, that example I showed you there, what we were doing is we're just basically cutting down as low as possible, and then really you can use a grass hire to create a bit of a tilth, and then sow directly into that where possible. So we would tend not to. And if you're growing a locally occurring mix in that particular area, it's going to be adaptive and will grow better and given the right conditions. As I say, that's why you're having a good range of donor sites is important for that.
Yeah, very good. You mentioned wood anemone there in passing, which I think largely spreads vegetatively. So I wonder, obviously it sets viable seed as well. So have you had success with spreading that via seed?
Seed is the seed's very low percentage germination because it has a lot of woodland species have dormancy issues. So they need, maybe a frost or you know, different conditions for them to germinate. The idea being that, you know, for example, foxglove can stay dormant for a very, very long time. So you then, if you disturb ground, you can see it coming up, and it could be sitting there for several hundred years. So its strategy is that it'll grow in a woodland, and then if there's a tree falls down, the sunlight kicks off the germination of that, you know. But I'd say wood anemone is a tricky one, the one from seed.
A question from Mark Finnegan, which is, what type of equipment is used for the cut and lift of meadows?
To cut and lift. Maybe he's talking about green hay.
Well, I think you might be talking about harvesting, so you know, traditional hay cut, or maybe not traditional, but what to use to actually cut a hay meadow.
Oh, you would with the hay meadow, you can use various types of mowers. In the old days, you used to use a what was called a finger bar mower, which is like lots of little pairs of scissors, and then that changed to a drum mower. So, and then once it's cut, it would be then rowed and moved into windrows. And then that process would knock the seed off, so it's going back into the soil, and then that's and if that's done as it's green, you can the hay bales can be spread across, and that technique used. But as I say, it's that change from hay to silage, where you're cutting maybe several times a year, that all the birds that would have nested, brown nesting birds, their numbers have declined massive, like the curlews and lapwings, because there's been a shift to silage production.
And then is there similar type of machinery then for smaller sites that you wouldn't necessarily put a full-size tractor on?
There would be what's called a two-wheel tractor, and there's several companies would make them, that they would as I say, they have a finger bar, or power side would be another name for them. So they're a handheld machine, but you can get a side delivery rake, it's called. We'll rake that up into lines, and then baler for that, an alpine baler, which it can be used on a small scale for that.
That's great. You mentioned there the green hay technique. I suppose that's one that we've seen used in recent years. How would that compare to your brush gathering technique?
But the main difference is you can't store seed if you use that technique. It all has to be moved within 48 hours. Otherwise, the seed, I mentioned that about 36 degrees, the seed heats up. Because it's green, it's not dried as in hay, it's green, so it heats up like compost. So you have to move that within 24 hours. Plus, if you have part of the field where there's, say, rush, or a species you don't want, soft rush, or an unwanted species such as dock, you can't avoid it. Whereas the brush harvesting technique, you can avoid it. Plus, you can store the seed until you're ready, and you can. One of the challenges is spreading this the green hay, because you have to pick it up again. So that's quite challenging in a brownfield site, for example. You can't just leave it there, otherwise it begins to decay. The slug production goes up, and they will then predate all the seedlings, if you know what I mean. So that's one of the challenges with that technique.
Very good. One more question then would be, are you trading in the Republic of Ireland eco-seeds? Are you available for consulting and to engage in projects?
Oh yes, yeah, definitely.
Very good. And obviously, we just need to Google you to get on if we need further advice or to get you involved in our projects.
Yeah, again, and as well, if you have donor sites, we're looking to try and find more of these donor sites, because in Germany they have quite a range of them, and even in England, like Emersgate Seeds who are an INSPA member. They would be probably one of the biggest seed companies in England. Have been brush harvesting since the 1980s, so they've got a lot of a good range of sites. But as they were always looking for more, because I think the demand for seed, it's a bit like with tree seed as well here. You know, it's trying to find this, the demand's going to increase, but the supply's not there. Whereas this is a way, you know, supply can be increased, but we've got to have it in place before the projects the projects take place, if you know what I mean. They need to be there at the design stage. So if say, for example, you're building a solar farm and it's gonna, like we did one where it was 40 odd acres, which is going to need a lot of seed. So it's matching donor sites to receptor sites for that kind of project, you know.
Yeah, and I assume then the more donor sites you get, the kind of the finer those regional areas would become, that they become smaller and more localized.
Exactly, so that we can get, and that works in the farmer's favor, because they get another income stream for them. So they can cut hay and get an income stream from the seed, but also that seed's local to that area, so that will be adapted over thousands of years, you know, or hundreds of years in cases, to suit the local climate, you know.
So I have a note then from Lorcan Scott, just to remind everyone that donor sites in Natura 2000 areas require permission from the NPWS.
Yes. So it would be the same in the north. But so again, with the loss, we've lost 98% of hay meadows, for example. But there are still, you know, there are still farmers who would have, although that generation is stopping going from hay to silage, but there would still be people who do still harvest hay. So it's trying to find those would be outside in WPS, etc. You know, so it's trying to find those areas as well, you know, so that they can, you know, become sites eventually, you know.
And I have one more question. I promise this will be the last one. For sites where it wouldn't, potential donor sites where access would be difficult for bigger machines, is it still possible to use them, or is it possible to scale down the harvesting?
Yes, definitely. I mean, so we that machine we had can be towed. We would use it up and for coffin restoration. It can be towed by a quad, or you can go down. As I say, we've a little handheld one that is used as a vacuum harvester. Is another method, but you have to take. There's a little thing in the side that sort of threshes everything. It's quite damaging to the insect population, so you have to take that out before you use that technique.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Mark, thank you so much for all the information and your excellent presentation.
Thank you for inviting me to talk.
We'll leave it there for today.
Okay.
Take care, everyone.
All the best.
Thanks, Mark. Bye. Bye.